Okay, second question. Your thoughts on active versus passive range of motion. If there's a discrepancy between them, how important do you think it is to bridge that gap? It is one of the big concepts in FRC. So, active versus passive range of motion, you'll often see it measured, let's say, roughly measured, let's say, okay, um, how to describe it. Let's say you're lying on your back. As a clinician, I bring your hip into internal rotation where you're completely passive and you're completely relaxed. And I bring you into hip internal rotation and I measure, okay, you have 45 degrees of passive hip internal rotation when I do it for you. And now I bring you back to neutral. I let go and you say, I say to you, okay, now you go as far as you can using your own muscles, and you can get to 30 degrees. Sorry. So actively, you can access 30 degrees active range of motion in hip internal rotation, and this applies to every joint. Passively, you can access 45 degrees of internal rotation. So there's a discrepancy there of about 15 degrees where people would say, okay, you don't actually have strength in that 15 degrees to access that range of motion. And some people would say that that's potentially a factor in what could cause injury because you have range that you don't have control over. That's a huge thing in the FRC world. I think there's value to that thought process. I think that there's also a lot of crap and a lot of voodoo and a lot of like salesmanship with that thought process that isn't actually valuable. So of course it depends. And I don't just mean like FRC. This is a concept that has been around for a long time, kind of active versus passive, but they've really popularized it. And some of that has been quite good, I think. Some of it not so good, but that might not necessarily be their fault. It might be the people that are using it maybe have misinterpreted or whatever. I don't know. But first of all, I would say when you see a lot of people online using this as a sales pitch to their clients, so or to people, because I lie you on your back. Okay, you have 45 degrees, you only have strength to bring you to 30 degrees, so there's 15 degrees there, and they will use that as a way to explain, like, here's why you're getting issues. You have all this range and you can only control this amount of range, so obviously you're going to have problems. I don't think that's like a 1 + 1 = 2, to be honest. Like some people make it out to be, oh, you clearly have these issues because you don't have control over that range. I'm not so sure about that. And also I will say, on the testing side of things, I think I see so often sloppy testing that I see so often that, like, when you do it passively, actually you don't know how to test well. You are going into internal or external rotation or whatever it is, and actually you're bringing them past their range of motion, and you don't understand that you're not moving their hip anymore. Now you're moving their pelvis. So of course it looks like they have 45 degrees, but actually you have been very sloppy with your testing, and maybe they had 35 degrees and you pushed them past the extra 10 because you wanted there to be a bigger discrepancy. I have seen that a lot, and that does kind of frustrate me, but it is a great way of selling something to a client because they won't really notice it. They definitely won't notice it. Most coaches or clinicians won't actually notice that. So that's one thing. I think the testing can be sloppy. The second thing is, when you see people, or if you bring them out to 45 degrees and you ask them, right, I'm going to let go, you hold it there, and they kind of lose it and they fall back 15 degrees, they lose 10 degrees or 5 degrees. I think you have to understand how we access our ranges of motion in life. So doing something on a table is not the same as how we move through the world. And there's so much I can say here. So it's apologies if I'm jumping around the place a little bit, but if you say to a tennis player, okay, I'm going to lie you on your back, I'm going to bring you out into internal rotation, there's your active versus your passive, there's the discrepancy. How And so they'll say, okay, you could potentially get injured if you access this range because you're not strong there. But that doesn't really account for how they would access that range if they were in a sport. How we would access that range if we were standing up on our feet would be by lengthening tissue more. So it would be about, it wouldn't be like if you were asking someone to lie on their back and bring their own leg out into internal rotation. They are going from a very passive position where they're just lying on their back. And you're asking them to like shorten tissues and leverage tissues that can pull you into internal rotation, but actually you haven't got any length through tissues that would help stabilize you there along the way, or would help pick up leverage there on the way. So the difference between lying on your back and getting into 30 degrees of internal rotation versus doing it in a squatting motion, or versus doing it in a change of direction motion, that's a huge difference. Because as I load in and change direction, and let's say something happens and I'm pushed into a position, muscles are lengthening along the way, and there's going to be a lot more pre-tension in those muscles. So it's not that I'm not strong in those positions. When I'm lying on my back, yeah, maybe I'm not strong there, but that doesn't mean I can't express strength or muscular control there, because when I actually move through the world, I have an amount of pre-tension in those muscles, and I have an amount of eccentric loading that actually puts those muscles into a more optimal length tension relationship to now do work. So I think that that's the crux of the issue, is measuring things lying on your back, where there's no pre-tensioning, no eccentric loading, is not the same as measuring things when you're changing direction or sprinting or going down into a squat or any of these things. So I don't think it's accurate to say you don't have the strength to control these ranges. I think it's more accurate to say you don't have the strength to control these ranges when you're lying on your back or when you're in an open chain position. But if your foot is on the floor and you're doing a change of direction or something like that, or a million other things, you would have got some eccentric loading. You would have got some pre-tension, and you would have more strength in those positions, because how you access the position is different than just lying on your back and doing it. This does lead you to another point, though, which is if you think about the creator of FRC, a very brilliant guy, I think a very smart guy. Now, that doesn't mean I think he's right about everything. I don't, but I do appreciate that he's a very smart guy, and he has a very good thought process behind things. Whether it's some of it is right or wrong or whatever, I think we can not be a hater, like just automatically be called a hater or something like that, just because you maybe disagree with some of the concepts, or don't fully agree with some of the concepts. But if you think about his background, and I've probably spoken about this on the podcast before, he's a jiu-jitsu guy as far as I can see. And so there is so much of going to be open chain end range positions at the shoulders and the hips and the knees and stuff like that. So I can absolutely see his point of view, where having all of this control and being able to build a lot of tension, a lot of strength in your very end ranges in an open chain position would be valuable, because effectively, if you're doing jiu-jitsu, someone is going to try and put you into that position, and you need to be strong there. So it might actually be perfect in that instance to do that type of training where you're trying to bridge that gap. I can also see, if you have someone who's quite hypermobile, why it might be valuable to get people into their end ranges and start to build a ton of strength there. So I can definitely see from that point of view why that might be valuable. But for those hypermobile people, I think they need to build more strength through the mid ranges, to be honest. They do need to build strength at the end ranges, but I think there's too much emphasis on the end ranges for hypermobile people. I think where they make their money a lot of the time is building a ton of strength in the mid ranges, and I think where things go wrong for them is in the more mid ranges, they lose tension and they lose control, and then they move with speed into the end range, and when they get there, it's too late. So I do think, yes, strengthening some of the end ranges for hypermobile people and bridging that gap between passive and active range of motion is very valuable, but my emphasis would be on building strength and control, and teaching them to pre-tension before they get to those end ranges. I think that's what would be very valuable. The other time then, kind of passive versus active range of motion, is after an injury. It's very useful to think about this. I think after an injury, let's take an ACL client, an ACL reconstruction or something like that. Let's say that they had a hamstring graft. And if you ever look at your ACL clients that have had a hamstring graft, they will be very, very weak because they're actually missing a bit of hamstring, obviously. They will be very weak in yes, outer range, like in a more knee extended positions where the hamstring needs to be strong, but more so in inner range knee flexion. So more deeper degrees of knee flexion where they need the hamstring to be strong there. They will be incredibly weak. You'll see like 50 to 70 to 80% deficits side versus side. So that's where I think, yes, okay, we've restored full range knee flexion, but actually I can bring your heel all the way to your butt and touch your butt with your heel. Excellent. We've restored passive range knee flexion. That is a massive tick that we need to get for an ACL client. And obviously a knee extension as well, full range knee extension. So massive tick there. But in knee flexion, if you ever measure that, actually measure that, get proper testing done, you'll see huge deficits in the unaffected side versus the affected side in how strong they are closer in middle and end range knee flexion through the hamstring, particularly if they've got a hamstring graft. And in that instance, you definitely want to strengthen it up, because it's not just this phantom measurement that you're taking where no one is ever good. Like no athlete, no person is ever good in their end ranges, to be honest. They'll cramp up. That's not just a good reason to say, okay, this is the cause of your problems and we need to strengthen your end ranges, because you're shit on both sides and everyone is shit in their end ranges, because it's about length tension relationships. So just not having that much strength in your very end ranges, lying on your back or lying on your front, isn't just the greatest reason ever to do that work. But when you've had a specific injury and now you're 50% weaker than you are on your unaffected side, that is a really good reason to do that specific work. So that's where I think that active versus passive range of motion is very, very valuable, and trying to strengthen that a specific range towards the end range can be very, very valuable, and it can be very tricky to bring up that strength. But let's stick with the ACL client. Like if you have someone that's had an ACL reconstruction, they're getting knee pain, like medial or lateral knee pain, and you do testing and the quads are looking pretty good, rate of force development is pretty good, like reactive strength is pretty good, and they're still getting knee pain, I bet you, but it's definitely worthwhile looking into hamstring strength in more knee flexion. And I would be surprised if they got a hamstring graft, if that was any good at all. If you didn't already train that a lot, it will be absolutely crap. There will be a deficit of at least 30%, maybe 50%. And if you look at the anatomy of the hamstrings, how they kind of, I think about them like wrapping around that knee. And if you look closely at the anatomy, like you can see how important those distal hamstrings can be for transferring force, kind of for firstly stabilizing the knee and transferring force like through the knee, not having kind of wobble there. And if or medial or lateral forces there, and if they're not strong and they're not maybe reactive and doing a really good job, then you can potentially see how a medial or lateral knee could get aggravated, because those tissues, and there is a decent bit of tissue there, they should be doing a really good job. So I think, to summarize all of what I've just said there, I think there's too much emphasis placed on active versus passive range of motion in the FRC world, in terms of like thinking that someone isn't strong there just because you tested them lying on their back. I think that is you're not understanding how length tension relationships work, how we pick up slack and take slack out of muscles when we lengthen. That's not to say it's not valuable. It's definitely valuable in martial arts. It's definitely valuable in all sports potentially. If people are entering end ranges, it's definitely helpful, but it's not as clear cut, I would say, as the explanation that is being given, which is you're just not strong there. Well, this is an open chain situation that you're assessing. And that does not mean that when I get into my foot being on the floor, that does not mean that the length tension relationships are the same and that I haven't taken slack out of the muscle. And now I can actually access that, because if we stick with the internal rotation example, when I access internal rotation when my foot is in the floor, I'm going to be lengthening a lot of tissue and building and taking a lot of slack out of all of the tissues around the hip muscles, or a lot of the tissues around the hip joint. So there's going to be a lot more tissues now that can assist me in that end range. Also, I will say, if you look at people when, let's say again, internal rotation, you're lying on your back, and I ask you to bring yourself out to end range internal rotation, everyone cramps in their TFL. And it's because they're doing funny things to try and get it there, because it's just not they're I can't even explain it well, to be honest. It's just, yeah, they'll just cramp through their TFL, which is such a small muscle to use as an internal rotator, because they're trying to compensate, because it's such a foreign movement to them. It's so foreign, and you can test something that's so foreign and so novel, and people will be weak there. That, and when I say weak there, I mean literally weak just there, not always in their end range, but just in that one position that you've put them in and tested them in. And that's a great sales pitch for a client, but it doesn't mean it's particularly always the most helpful thing. So hopefully that's a relatively fair appraisal, not perfect, because it's probably a long conversation and I've probably skipped over things and not given a fully rounded answer there, but hopefully it gives people at least a little bit to think about. And yeah. Okay. So last question. As